Good morning for those watching in the United States. Good afternoon in Europe. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this event on the US-France relationship, launching our new report, Sovereign Solidarity, France, the US, and Alliances in a post-COVID-19 world, co-written by our senior fellows, Jeff Lightfoot and Olivier Remy-Bell. This is a conversation today on this report in partnership with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. I want to say just a word of this paper because I think it's really terrific work by our authors who have spent months talking to American, French, European experts, not only to talk about the importance of the bilateral relationship in defense and security between these two old allies, but also look at the future of alliances and how this relationship could maybe make us think about new kinds of partnership with more autonomous and sovereign partners. In this moment of presidential transition, I think it's really key for us at the Atlantic Council to continue to push strategic thinking on the future of alliances. As you know, we are committed to US engagement with allies on the world stage, especially in a time of great power competition. So I really want to thank you, Jeff and Olivier, and thank all of our distinguished panelists for joining today for this critical conversation. Let me introduce, before we turn to our panelists, General Jim Jones, Chairman of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Chairman Emeritus of the Atlantic Council. You know him well, former National Security Advisor. But I should say, more importantly for this conversation, someone who knows France very well, who spent time there, and who was also the National Security Advisor when France rejoined the NATO Integrated Military Command. General Jones, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you and good morning, Ben. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And if I may start out by saying bienvenue à tous, welcome to everyone. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this timely conversation on the future of the US-France security and defense relationship and the kinds of alliances the United States will need in the coming years. It was a particular honor for me to contribute a foreword along with the French Minister of Defense, Florence Parly, to the Atlantic Council report that we will launch today. Sovereign Solidarity, the United States, France, and Alliances in a Post-COVID World by Olivier Remy-Bell and Jeff Lightfoot. The report makes a compelling case that as the incoming Biden administration looks to put alliances and partnerships at the center of its international engagement, we are confident that it will find a uniquely capable ally in France. France is a truly unique American ally. It's a country that takes its security and defense, as well as its independence, very, very seriously. That makes France a particularly valuable ally, as we've seen in the last 10 years, when our forces have made remarkable gains in cooperation and interoperability on the battlefield, on the sea, and in the air. It also means that from time to time, the US and France find each other working at cross purposes on political matters or questions of national sovereignty. But from my experience, our two countries are much more likely to achieve their core objectives when we are pulling in the same direction. But when the US and France work at cross purposes, we often fall short of our goals. It was a highlight of my career at NATO and at the White House to see the US and France shake off some of the legacy Cold War baggage that kept French forces from taking their proper place in NATO and in cooperation with US forces. One of those achievements was France's reintegration into NATO, as Ben just mentioned, at the Strasbourg-Kell summit of 2009. As a result of its reintegration, France took over command of the Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia, and I'm pleased that France's first SACT, my friend, the General Stéphane Abrial, is tuning in today. Stéphane, very good of you to join us. It will be up to a new generation of policymakers in the United States and in France to continue the modernization of this two-century-old partnership to meet new challenges like China's rise, emerging technology, Russian hybrid threats, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and so many other things. This important report offers advice on how to maximize the gain and minimize the pain in the US-France relations. It outlines a forward-looking agenda for the US and France in the Indo-Pacific, in cyberspace, and even in outer space. In exploring the relationship between a complex and valuable ally like France, the report also offers fresh thinking into the emerging debate about the kinds of alliances the United States will need in a post-COVID strategic environment. So now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to His Excellency Philippe Etienne, the Ambassador of France to the United States, for his introductory remarks. Ambassador Etienne brings a long and rich history at the highest levels of the French foreign policy establishment, having served as President Macron's national security advisor prior to coming to Washington. Mr. Ambassador, it's my pleasure and my honor to hand the floor over to you for your opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, General. And thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, dear friends. It's really a pleasure to me, and thank you, Ben, for hosting this event in the Atlantic Council. Congratulations also to the two authors of the report. With the new administration to come in January, setting its sights on the future, it's more important than ever to talk with allies and partners so that we can build together. The relationship between France and the US started with a military alliance, and the phrase, America's oldest ally is not used in vain. For centuries, we have been there for each other when it mattered, from Yorktown to Belleau Woods, Normandy to 9/11, we have always answered the call. And yet our alliance is not just something, of course, for history books. What we do together is very concrete. And thank you, General, for what you said in your introduction. In the past few years, we have chased together terrorists in the Middle East and the Sahel. Our air forces have struck Syrian chemical program sites. Both our navies sailed the South China Sea. We have developed new avenues of cooperation in space or cyber. Going forward, I believe there is much we can do together. Our two democracies strongly believe in defending the rules-based international order by bolstering multilateralism, by being firm with authoritarians. Together, we can tackle the technological challenges that underpin the new strategic environment. And together, we can keep sharing the responsibilities of fighting against terrorism. Reading this report, I just want to reflect a moment on the role of alliances. The Atlantic Council is spot on. We are stronger with allies. The strength of the US lies in its ability to gather partners and allies around itself, and in alliances like NATO, which remain the cornerstone of our collective defense. What kind of allies do the United States need to face great power competition? It's obviously first for Washington to decide. As you know, France invests in its defense, operates those high-end capabilities we need so much, provides intelligence and situation awareness on all threats, including peer competitor and terrorism, and is not afraid to take charge of its own security and to shoulder a greater share of the burden, deploys forces overseas and conducts combined and joint large operations. But so can others. The European sovereignty agenda aims to get Europeans to invest in their defense and take on a greater share of the burden. And this can clearly be an asset for American security and our common security to face both great power competitors and terrorism. Does that mean that the European dimension of our defense policies should be more affirmed? Yes, if it means an ownership by Europeans of the security issues, which will drive their continued investment and help them act where they have to and where the US, for good reasons, and when he's not ready to act. Does that mean that European allies would move away from the transatlantic alliance? Certainly not. Furthering our European sovereignty does not mean turning our backs on the US. It certainly does not mean sitting in a middle ground between the US and China or Russia. The transatlantic bond will always be strong and stronger. We might sometimes do things our own way, but we will always be there when it matters, as we have in the past 2 centuries. Thank you for your attention then. And now I'm happy to pass the floor to Olivier and Jeff and to congratulate them again for their excellent report.
Many thanks, Ambassador, and many thanks, General Jones, for your kind words of introduction. So we'll now be saying a few words on the report. Don't worry, this is going to be short. We all want to hear from our exciting panel afterwards. Jeff and I are really thrilled to have worked on this and to have delved into the Franco-American relationship. And for me, not just because I'm French, as you can hear, but because this is such a deep partnership that we feel is often not so well known in Washington. So what is this report about? Well, it works on 2 levels. First, it's a primer for policymakers looking at ideas about how to cooperate with France, or what can France bring to the table, what are the French capabilities, but also how do you go about doing it? How do you engage with the French system? How do you engage with the French mindset? On the second level, however, it's a case study in alliance management. What we're trying to do in the report is tease out what the dynamics of the Franco-American defense relationships say about the way alliances are managed. And so this report, we believe, can be useful to you if you are either a policymaker looking at concrete ideas of cooperation with France, or if you're puzzled about how France works, or if you're invested in the current conversation about alliances, about US alliances, and about the role and values of partners. So without further ado, let's dive in the report. And Jeff, I think you were going to retrace the ups and downs of the relationship and see what can be learned from there.
Yeah, thanks, Olivier. We felt that to look to the future of the US-France security and defense relationship, it was also important to look at the relationship in its historical context. It's a relationship marked by volatility, by ups and downs. And as we heard from Ambassador Etienne, General Jones, moments of great sacrifice and shared contributions to achieving common goals. It's, of course, was mentioned in President-elect Biden's call yesterday with President Macron that France is America's oldest alliance. And we know well, and we heard from Ambassador Etienne about France's remarkable contributions to American independence, to the fact that France's sale of the Louisiana Purchase to the United States in the early 19th century helped make the United States into a continental superpower that in the 20th century was able to intervene in World War I and in World War II to France's benefit. So we've got these tremendous moments of our national destinies being bound together. But in more recent years, we've also had moments where we've worked across purposes, moments of history of conflict in this relationship that to some degree have, I think, maybe to this day, hang over the relationship a little bit. Thinking of 1966, General de Gaulle's abrupt departure of NATO's integrated command, asking US forces to leave France. 2003, the language of cheese-eating surrender monkeys and freedom fries as we conflicted over the vision about the war in Iraq. But fortunately, as a relationship, if it has its downs, it also has its ups as well. And in more recent years, we've seen remarkable gains in bilateral cooperation and interoperability, particularly in the fight on terrorism between US and French forces. In 2 theaters, in the Sahel, where we think is a model example of transatlantic burden sharing, with the French and the European forces taking the lead with American enabling forces. And of course, in the Levant, where over the last several years, our forces have been fighting together against ISIS. And we're very fortunate to have Admiral Jamie Fogo, who's going to be on the panel to follow this report briefing, who can speak to the remarkable US-French naval cooperation. But one particular example of the French Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier backfilling a US carrier in the Gulf to ensure a continued carrier presence in that counter-ISIS operation is just one example of the really remarkable gains through operations that our 2 forces have made over in recent years. The United States is starting to think differently about its security challenges. Recent weeks have shown the terrorism threat is not gone, it's not going away, but the US is looking more to a major power competition set of thinking. And so Olivier, maybe you can offer some thoughts about the next chapter of this security and defense relationship.
Yes, many thanks, Jeff. And as you were saying, France and the US have reached a dense level of cooperation thanks to counterterrorism. But now we've identified 3 new engines of growth to carry forward the relationship, as both countries are more and more concerned about great power competition, and these are space, cyber, and the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, there is already extensive cooperation in these 3 areas. This isn't new, but we picked them as key areas where we see great prospects for several reasons. First, they match the priorities set in the American national defense strategies, and they provide the key tool to face the strategic rivalry with China. But also, these are domains in which France has much to bring to the table. It has conceptual maturity. In space, cyber, and the Indo-Pacific, strategies have been published in the past couple of years, and the conceptual framework is in place. France also has the structures to deal with it. There is now, for example, a Space Command or Cyber Command in the French Armed Forces. And finally, France has been investing heavily in those areas. For instance, the military programming law sets aside about 4 billion euros for space capabilities, and notably to upgrade France's unique ability to track objects in low Earth orbit, and therefore flesh out the concept of active defense that was etched in the space defense strategy. France is also investing in the Indo-Pacific, not just because it's a key region for great power competition, but also, and this is often less well known, because it's part of the French homeland. There are over 1.5 million French citizens living there in the Indo-Pacific on French territories, which is, for our American friends, about the size of Hawaii. So these are the key areas we see prospective military cooperation, but that won't be enough. And France and the US also need to deepen their conversations on what we have termed the great political misunderstandings. And I think, Jeff, you are going to dive into that.
Yes, thanks, Olivier. So our report identifies what we call the 4 great misunderstandings of areas of recent political conflict and challenge between the United States and France, sort of the concerning mood music behind the otherwise strong military-to-military cooperation. And the first that we hear is differences of perspective, particularly in the American national security establishment but also among some Central and East European allies about President Macron's outreach to Russia. Sort of at best, it's seen as not producing a whole lot of results. At worst, it's seen as potentially undermining a common united transatlantic front against Russia's behavior in whether it's Belarus, Ukraine, et cetera. Secondly, the differences of views about how to manage China's rise. I think Ambassador Etienne touched upon what we kept hearing from our French interlocutors is the right way to get secure French buy-in in China regarding China's rise, which is not to try to engage France in sort of a hegemonic struggle between the US and China, but really focus on managing or preserving the international rules and norms that are shared interests of the United States and France. There is a concern that we heard from French interlocutors of not allowing Europe or European sovereignty to be undermined by this clash of the titans between the US and China. The third is differences about burden sharing and contributions in NATO. We heard from some American interlocutors that they'd like to see more French contributions in NATO operations for a country of France's size, scope, and ambition. But on the French side, we often heard a perspective that NATO's not, of course, it is the cornerstone of their security policy, as Ambassador Etienne just pointed out, but France contributes bilaterally, contributes through the US, it contributes through its own efforts to take on its share of the transatlantic security burden. And then finally, this question of strategic autonomy, which we'll come back to, has also been an area where I think many in the US have maybe misunderstood, or there's been this feeling that it might be duplication of transatlantic security assets, or potentially some sort of decoupling of pushing the US out of European security. So these are misunderstandings that are not just misunderstandings, or in some cases real differences of interest, of approach. I think some of the historical factors that we talked about hang over a little bit, these policy differences, but we did feel like there was a need for an elevated strategic exchange between our two countries on some of the medium to long-term challenges. We heard from former senior intelligence officials in the US that the operational and tactical intelligence relationship is outstanding, but that the strategic exchange about the mid to long term, how we see Russia, how we see China, that left a little bit to be desired. So we think more can be done there. And we also suggested a 2+2 exchange between our foreign and defense ministers might better integrate our diplomatic and defense approaches to ensure a greater strategic level of understanding about the common challenges of the future. But getting the relationship right with France and allies that are really protective of their sovereignty also requires a little bit of thinking about how to manage about alliance software in the American foreign policy establishment, which isn't always easy. So Olivier, maybe you'd like to speak to a new model of engaging France and sovereignly minded allies.
Sorry about that. Yes, Jeff, so thank you very much. As we were saying, as we were talking to French and American policymakers, one of the things we realized is that this was a case study also about how to manage France, but also independent-minded allies like France. And what we wanted to highlight and what we found during talking to all these policymakers is that what makes France a capable partner and what makes France an independent-minded partner, well, they're really two sides of the same coin. To put it differently, France investing in its security, and France sometimes saying no to Washington, or at least saying let's do it differently, really have the same underpinnings. And these are a sense of ownership of its security dilemma. And we really believe this is interesting for the way alliances are managed, because if the US is seeking partners who pay greater attention to their security, who invest in their defense, who shoulder a greater share of the burden, then it also means partners who have a greater sense that they own their security dilemmas. And that might mean partners that are a little bit more like France. And so there is something instructive more broadly about alliances in the Franco-American defense relationship. So what we do in the report is try to sketch out a method for engaging partners like this. It revolves around leaving them a greater ownership of the political narrative, allowing them to have maybe their own political narrative, giving them a space to work in parallel rather than in tow, and creating that area where we are working towards the same purpose, maybe not through the same ways, on the same means, but we are broadly getting there. And we believe that we can get an American policymakers can get a lot more out of alliances if they do that method of engagement as well. And this obviously has implications for the way we think about European sovereignty. And I think, Jeff, you were going to say a few words about this.
Yeah, I think just two final concluding thoughts before we throw it to a really outstanding panel to follow. Our research showed that a lot of the gains in the last 10 years took place through military operations. France and the US both found the other one to be incredibly valuable. Secretary Mattis called France a partner of choice in the fight against terrorism in operations against ISIS. But France and the US didn't have that legacy infrastructure that the US has with Canada, the UK, Australia, and so they had to build it on the fly. So operations were sort of the driver of some of these gains over the last 10 years. To move forward in the directions that we highlight in our report and Indo-Pacific, cyber and space, it's going to require management of those political differences that we talked about, but it's also going to require real purpose and intentionality to get to the outcome that we're hoping to see achieved. And finally, the question of strategic autonomy is identified as one of the great misunderstandings. I think the rhetoric around this sits badly sometimes with other countries in Europe and with the United States. We actually think that both the US and France need bilateral engagement on this issue, that the US would do well not to reject this concept or to ignore it, but actually to engage with it and try to shape it in a way that aligns with American interests. And we also think, maybe provocatively, that France needs a US strategy for Europe, that it's going to be difficult for France to get the Europe that it wants without greater buy-in from some of the more Atlanticist countries who see Washington as supportive of this agenda. So as General Jones said, we think that in the Atlantic Council motto is stronger together, stronger with allies. We think the US and France history shows that when we're working together, we're much more likely to achieve our objectives. And so we hope this report helps contribute some to thinking about how we can do that, not just for US, France, but for the broader transatlantic relationship. So thanks for your time and for your attention on that. And now we've got a fantastic panel that our friend Reem Momtaz, the Politico France reporter, will take from here. So it's my pleasure to hand the floor to you, Reem.
Thank you, Jeff. And it is a pleasure to be able to moderate this panel at such a, timely, on such a timely topic. I think we're all, wondering where do we go from here after the last couple of years and what this new administration might change. or not. And so just allow me to do some brief introductions before we sort of jump right into a conversation. And I just wanted to also let our attendees know that we'd like this to be as conversational as possible. So please don't hesitate to raise your hands to ask questions or to send us questions in writing as the conversation is going, instead of just waiting till the end, because that way it'll just be more interactive. So first of all, let me introduce our wonderful panelists. I'll start with Ambassador Alice Guiton. She's the Director General for International Relations and Strategy at the French Ministry of the Armed Forces. And she comes with extensive experience in the alliance relationship, but also in arms controls, having previously served as France's permanent rep to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, but also as a deputy permanent rep to NATO. Dr. Tori Tassig, she's the research director of the Transatlantic Relations 2021 at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and Admiral James Fogo, the former commander of US naval forces in Europe, a Francophone and a Francophile, might I add, who comes from a long, long line of military men who have served in France, in World War I, World War II, and of course with him as well. And, I wanted to actually just jump into questions quickly and directly. And I'd like to start actually perhaps with where Jeff and Olivier Remy ended. And I'll start with you, Admiral Fogo, actually. I'd love to know, what do you hear and what do you understand when you hear French officials say and talk about strategic autonomy?
Well, Rémi, bonjour. Et permettez-moi de faire un tout petit mot en français, française, francophone, francophile et mes amis américains. C'est un très grand plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui pour cette gala d'essai, comme nous disons à Sciences Po, au niveau du rapport de Olivier et Jeff. So thank you. And Rémi, great question to kick it off. Strategic autonomy, where do we go with this? And as you pointed out, I have a long family history of two grandfathers in the trenches in World War I. My father hit the beach in Normandy, and I was born in Europe and went back and was educated in France, and then returned 5 times to the continent with 4 NATO commands. At every turn, I found that there was a necessity for dialogue on the issue of strategic autonomy. And through that dialogue, we could come to some kind of a compromise. I'll give you a historical example, if I may, and that is I had the honor of addressing a distinguished crowd of Americans and French veterans and active duty officers at Invalides last September for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Paris. 2 of the quotes that I came across were ironic. I think that picture that you had in the front of the report might have been one that was taken by my PAOs, if it is indeed the Eisenhower and the de Gaulle sailing together in the Mediterranean, and that was one of the backdrops I used. During the onslaught of Operation Overlord, General Eisenhower made the comment, the French are difficult allies. General de Gaulle made the comment, the Americans are difficult allies. I think that's one of the reasons why we can get along, and the argument then was, of course, the liberation of Paris. Eisenhower's position, old men and young men from the German army guarding Paris. We don't need to go through there. We're going to go around, save our resources. And de Gaulle, of course, the pride of the country, the capital of the country, the indications for morale and bringing people back together, and the relationship after the war. So we need to take Paris, and ultimately we did. So we go through these things, and somebody had mentioned General de Gaulle in 1966 and NATO and strategic autonomy. Somebody didn't mention, though, the chief of defense back at that time was General Ayeré. And General Ayeré said, when asked, where does France target its nuclear weapons? And the answer to the crowd back in Washington was tout Saint-Zimou, all bearings. So we are looking at everybody. Now we move forward. We move forward from the Iraq war and into the reintegration of NATO. That was a big question for France concerning giving up any strategic autonomy. But they came back in, and the chief of defense at the time was General Georges Lannes, and he was all in, sent his best officers. I was at SHAPE when that happened, and I watched it take place. And I was the benefactor or the beneficiary of those fine officers when I was commander of JFC in Naples, Italy for 3 years as a 4-star. And so I think that when it comes right down to brass tacks, if we can agree, we can be difficult with one another, but if we can agree on our common strategic interests, for instance, Jeff mentioned Charles de Gaulle. She actually took over a carrier gap in the Arabian Gulf for the Americans. She actually became CTF 150 with American forces underneath her. That takes permission from the Secretary of Defense and Collective Defense. We did the same thing with our destroyer Carney after the Balaklan attacks in the Eastern Mediterranean when Charles de Gaulle needed air cover as she was going in and doing strike missions in Syria to retaliate for those heinous attacks. And so the key thing here is continuing the dialogue to come to our common interests. And I know that that will continue and probably get even better in the future. Thank you.
Admiral, I just wanted to kind of follow up on one thing that you said that caught my attention, which is if the US and France can agree on common strategic interests, do you think today across the board that is the case? And if not, where is it not the case?
Well, I think there's been some difficult discussions across the Atlantic between Washington and Paris for the last 4 years. Part of that has been the argument over burden sharing. And Europeans view burden sharing as something broader than just 2% of GDP in a budget. For me, I think the most important thing is having partners and friends and allies who are reliable. Again, France is a nuclear power. France has a very capable submarine force. France is helping the United States fight the fourth battle of the Atlantic against the Russian Federation. France is there with us, Joint Forces Command Norfolk, the brand new command that stood up. Stéphane Abrial, as stated, was the first SAC-T. I was at his change of command, and he brought technology and transformation and interoperability into the alliance, which is so important. So there are some difficult issues to deal with, notwithstanding our civilian leaders and masters who have got to figure it out and do a handshake as this new administration comes in and then move forward. We do not have the luxury of wasting our resources, of double tapping things that don't need to be done twice or done by two different forces. We've got to work together, we've got to integrate, and again, interoperability is the key. So if we came together with the amount of force that France can deliver and the rest of the allies can deliver, we would certainly send a very strong message of deterrence. And ultimately, if deterrence fails, a defense of the alliance's interests across a wide range of 30 countries now and 41 partners.
Ambassador Guiton, I wanted to get you into this conversation and ask you actually the same question I asked the Admiral, which is, but perhaps in a different way. When you and other French sort of officials talk about strategic autonomy, what do you mean? What do you envision?
Well, first of all, let me thank you very warmly for having me on board of this panel. That's an excellent opportunity to put emphasis on some of the main issues that we're addressing on a daily basis, especially because our cooperation with the United States is just, all over the place. We are doing it in the strategic field, strategic assessments in terms of assessing the situation in a number of crises, unfolding crises, fast evolving situations, but also because we're mobilizing our forces in the same theaters. And I can only concur with much that has been said regarding the unprecedented level of cooperation that we have reached. Now, about strategic autonomy, I'm always struck by the fact that, remember back 2009, where former president of the Republic, Nicolas Sarkozy, decided that France should reintegrate the military structures of NATO. He said, that's a great moment. And I remember his speech at the Congress at that time. He said, that's the moment where we turn the page of misunderstandings between two sides of the Atlantic regarding what the European defense should serve for, the fact that there will be no longer arguments about duplications, there will be only the perception that we are all working in support of the same values, in the same multilateral solutions to transregional crises, conflicts, threats from terrorism to proliferation, and that we will be able to do it with the Europeans more in a way, more empowered. And that means with more resources. And perhaps, Admiral, just to correct one fact, on burden sharing, we're exactly on the same page with our American friends. We are standing very high on the priority of the 2%. You know that our military planning law is referring to it for the first time. So the 2% objective is set in stone, if I may say so. And we, of course, argue vis-à-vis our other European partners that they should do the same. But it's a matter of strategic autonomy. It's a matter of political will. It's a matter of operational capacities and readiness to deploy reactivity. It's also a matter of joining up, teaming up, including with our US partners in a number of areas, like in the Levant or in the Sahel, in order to make sure that we can cross intelligence, we can target terrorist groups, for instance, and then deliver the right responses, including mobilizing, for instance, some of the EU tools of response in the field of development, governance, etc. So I think, you know, the issue of complementarity has been with us for a lot of time. It is raising a lot of emotional reactions, but in the end, we all wish the same: work together, making sure that we have more capabilities to address such a wide spectrum of threats. And looking at our strategic review in 2017 and what has been amplified over the last few months, I can only say that there is a lot we should do together. And if the Europeans have more will, more capacities, and including more determination to do by themselves some of the tasks that will allow protect them from foreign threats, that's in the collective interest of our transatlantic security.
Tori, I want to bring you in here and kind of, you know, I guess bring your eyes of sort of the political scientist into this conversation. And I'd love to know, why do you think there is, you know, this term of strategic autonomy is such a lightning rod at the end of the day? Why is it so difficult for these two allies, who are the oldest allies together, who work so well together when it matters? Why can't they agree on, you know, how to define those two rather simple words?
Well, thank you, and it's a privilege to be on this panel with you and Admiral Fogo and Ambassador Guiton. This report is coming at a timely moment in the transatlantic relationship, and I'm glad we're having this discussion following the US presidential election, if we can say it's now following rather than before, because I think we have some insight into what this transatlantic relationship could look like going forward and what type of person and administration we will have in the White House to partner with. Just to zoom in on your question, Reem, yes, this concept of strategic autonomy has been controversial, to say the least, and it has kind of rubbed people in Washington the wrong way for quite some time. Just to answer it very briefly, and then we can go into other questions. Looking back, this has, as both the Admiral and Ambassador have noted, been a contentious issue because of questions over burden sharing, where Washington tends to look at the transatlantic relationship through the lens of NATO and 2% defense spending. This idea has seemed to run counter to that joint mission of enhancing defenses within NATO. But I think if we're to move the strategic conversation forward, where those in Washington might be concerned about strategic autonomy is where it could lead to a sense of equidistance for Europe between the United States and between authoritarian competitors such as China and Russia. I disagree that that is what this concept means, but you do hear it time and time again in Washington that strategic autonomy on behalf of the Europeans means that more autonomy to side with China and to side with Russia where differences exist. So I think strategically looking forward, that's where one of the concerns lies.
You know, I'm actually going to do something that I rarely do, which is start actually asking you the questions that are coming in, because we have a bunch of them. So let's go. Leo Michel actually says, the report notes that a French general is now deputy commander of the US 3rd Infantry Division, and an American general holds an equivalent position with the French 3rd Armored Division. This exceptional arrangement was agreed during the Obama administration and implemented under the now outgoing administration? Why not explore similar arrangements where senior officers are embedded within the other nation's operational chain of command structures from our perspective, from our respective air forces and navies? And why not organize an annual small seminar of US and French flag officers, similar to the US-UK Senior Leaders Forum, begun several years ago under CJCS Dempsey, so that we can improve our intellectual interoperability at a strategic operational level? And that is actually something that the report really stressed on, which is sort of the, I guess, the deficient sort of bilateral cooperation at that level. So I'll open it to Ambassador Guiton and then to Admiral Fogo.
No, thank you very much. Honestly, this is the kind of proposal that we would be ready to explore, because obviously interactions between our military officials are already extremely intense. But obviously we need to increase every day the level of intellectual interoperability, as it has been said. And of course, we're relying for that on a number of tools and instruments and mechanisms that do exist. The cooperation, for instance, between the École de Guerre and the American structures are extremely important, including in the new areas of competition like space, and including very recently we were part of a joint exercise regarding space, the Shriver seminar, and there was an exchange of officials between our two systems that was unprecedented, including for the US side. So I can say that, including in those kind of fields, cyber as well, we are doing a lot to make sure that we can converge, and interoperability is really crucial if we are to continue joint operations just like we are delivering today.
Thank you, Ambassador. Admiral, do you want to add something?
Yeah, first of all, bonjour, Leo. Thank you very much for the question. Been a while since we've chatted. Glad we're reconnected. So I'm fully in Leo's court. I think the more exchange and interoperability between US forces, French forces in commands that are unique and national commands structures, that's good for us. Let me give you a couple of examples. So at my headquarters in NATO, and I was a 1-star, 3-star, and 4-star over 10 years in Naples associated with NATO and command billets. There was always a French officer on the staff. I had 2 French officers as my J3s, and that gave me insight into things that were happening, not just in the European theater, but down in Africa, and particularly in the Sahel, where I had significant interests. And I think we all ought to be doing more. I think France is leading the way there. The Deputy Chief of Staff at SHAPE headquarters, a guy that came to our headquarters a lot, collaborated with me in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, which is always a flashpoint. I think I was the first officer to hire a French LNO within the headquarters at 6th Fleet. And that officer turned over once, and Commandant Eric Jazelin was there when I left. Absolutely superb example of a French naval officer, helpful, insightful, and one who didn't get into the politics, but one who sat down, rolled up his sleeves, and helped us get to brass tacks and get to solutions. Likewise, we put some of our best officers in France and Paris. SEAL Olmsted scholar Roger Plassey is an example. Roger brought SHEM, the War College, and senior officers that are rising to flag rank to me over 3 times. And I either visited with them in person when I was director of the Navy staff, or via this link, via Zoom, with them in Paris or them touring in Washington. That's an invaluable exchange, and that's an exchange that takes place between young men and women who are coming up in the ranks, who have a certain level of experience, and coming against my experience, we can have a pretty deep discussion on how we can get around some of these issues of strategic autonomy as they move forward. The real nice thing about this is, in the event that people come and they go from these billets and they move on into command structures in France or in the United States, say we have a problem, deterrence fails, and we have to defend somewhere. You want the person on the other end of the phone that picks up to be somebody that you know, that you have a relationship with, because it works a lot better. I could call Yves Joly, Charles-Henri Duché, or Christophe Prézouk at any time and ask them for help, and they would give it to me, and likewise in return. So those are the kinds of relationships that we must build over time, and we must have officers starting at a lower level I'm talking at the lieutenant commander, the educational levels, the war colleges, and on up and into the integrated command structures of our two nations. I think it's a great question, and I'm fully behind that initiative continuing and expanding.
If I could just follow up with both of you on this, because the report was very clear and very explicit on the fact that it wasn't happening enough between the US and France, the deployment of officers at a lower level in each other's structures, as much as it, for example, happens in Germany or in the UK. Can you shed light a bit on why that is the case and why it hasn't been happening? Or perhaps now it's happening more, but why hasn't it been happening before? Oh, I see Ambassador Guiton shaking her head. Do you not agree?
I can be quick because, in fact, in terms of political will and appetite to do more, we are extremely open, and I think we're doing our utmost to satisfy those opportunities, including. But honestly, we're focusing also a lot on what is operationally efficient and trying to sort out the crisis at hand together, and that's why we train as we fight together, and I think this is the greatest way to testify to the amplitude, the density of our cooperation. I mean, including very recently, we participated in NATO exercises of major scale, that including like dynamic mongoose, for instance, including the US, Canada, Germany, Norway, and the UK. We enhanced our anti-submarine and anti-surface warfare skills. This is a kind of thing that we really value because it focuses on high-end capabilities and high-end knowledge. Military expertise. So more training, more interoperability, more opportunities to participate in joint exercises. That's exactly what we're looking at. I think there is an additional element as part of our strategic autonomy. We're also looking for more opportunities to coordinate in order to share respective rules. And I think, for instance, when we look at the Indo-Pacific, we both have a number of partnerships in that region, and it's important for us to be able to get our people in the different military bases all over the world, having the right network of contacts and being able to just ring the phone.
Admiral, did you? Yeah.
Yeah. So, Reem, great question, and I couldn't agree more with the ambassador. Over a decade in Naples, we went progressively from a door that was pretty much closed to partially open, and then to probably better than halfway open on intel sharing agreements with the French. The reason that we are so successful in working together with our British counterparts and our French counterparts in the Fourth Battle of the Atlantic is because that door went open. Now, I realized that early on in the game, and this is a problem for both countries because there has to be a certain amount of bona fide trust with one another and sharing information between the intelligence communities and information that each partner is allowed access to. As Admiral Mullen was famous for saying, he had a lot of great bumper stickers. One of them is, you can't surge trust. You have to build it over time. So starting with small steps, bringing in a liaison officer at the rate of commander to a headquarters and giving him a badge and giving him access to Naval Forces Europe and to Sixth Fleet and allowing him to come on our watch floor. Opening up our watch floor in Naples, which was formerly closed to just American eyes only, and then bringing in the Charles de Gaulle, bringing in the French LNOs, bringing in other LNOs from Italy and other countries is very important. So as this door continues to open, we can do more. I talked about, and Jeff talked about the Charles de Gaulle in the Arabian Gulf. Not the first time that she had deployed there and operated with American forces. The first time she did it was with Rear Admiral Kevin Sweeney, who was on board his carrier as a strike group commander, and there was frustration between the French carrier and the American carrier because they couldn't communicate. So we put a tent up and we rigged a SIPRNet link, and it was a temporary thing. We've gotten a lot better at that, and we now have more permanent links where we can talk to one another, and that is so important. It's ridiculous to put forces like that, of that magnitude, in the field without the ability to share intelligence, tactical, and strategic data. And if you're going to be involved in something in an area that is high tension, high stress, potentially that might go kinetic, and in particular, when you are providing collective defense for one another, like the de Gaulle was in the Gulf, or like we were doing in the Eastern Mediterranean during the attacks after Balakline, you've got to share that information. Everybody has a right to know. They have a right to know what the threat is. They have a right to know what the targets are. When we did the Syria strikes in April, the French, the UK, and US forces in the Mediterranean, my forces, John Warner, and the forces in the Gulf with Long Aquilino were all on the same sheet of music. That worked extremely well. So if you look at the difference between when I first got to SHAPE in 2009 before integration of French forces back into NATO to when I just left in July of 2020, the difference is night and day. We've made a lot of progress. Now I'd like to see more progress made, and I don't want to wait a decade to do that. So I think we have an opportunity here with a new horizon, a new administration to move forward.
Thank you, Admiral. I'm going to cede the floor to General Abriel, who has a question for the panel as well.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me. I congratulate the authors, and thanks to my friends Jim Jones and James Fogo for the kind words. I must say I couldn't support more what has just been said by both Ambassador Guiton and Admiral Fogo on the necessity to have the military institutions cooperate as much as they can. If I try to look back into 2009, there were many reasons why the US on the one side, France on the other side decided that it would be good for France to come back into the military structure, and that France does it in good conditions. On the US side, I discussed a few times with my friend Jim Jones. There was a point one, but the French forces were what they are, and that there is in France a strong political readiness to engage into operations. Point two, France wanted NATO to change. And if you're not part of the club, you cannot change the rules. So France joining the club should help changing. And point three, the French defense budget was quite high, and France being back into the military structure could become an incentive for other nations in Europe to increase their budgets. Obviously, point one and two worked very well, point three did not. On the French side, President Sarkozy's vision was that the continued opposition between the EU and the US was detrimental, the EU and NATO, sorry, was detrimental to both. And that having these two institutions working hand in hand would help both make progress together or separately, but at least each progress in one could enhance the progress in the other. This did not work well. It did work well for NATO, but not that well for the EU. One of the main questions was the institutional relationship between EU and NATO, but that by side, one of the main questions was, again, the point you mentioned from the beginning on sovereignty, strategic autonomy. Many people in France, probably in Europe, think, and I'm one of them, but the positive steps the EU has made in the recent years were mainly, or at least strongly, due to the attitude of the current US administration, and that the EU built itself against this attitude. But there are also many people in Europe, and many governments have started giving signs of it, that the Biden administration would be much more understanding, would be much more helpful, and therefore my fear is that some authorities in Europe run back to Washington as soon as they can, instead of going to Paris and trying to help build this French vision of strategic autonomy. A good example has been given to us recently by the article which Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer wrote in Politico, when she wrote, "Illusions of European strategic autonomy must come to an end," which is in my mind a full-fledged pledge to the US. So, two questions. I didn't read the report yet, but I read the executive summary where they mentioned that the US should encourage for all the allies to embrace the idea of a more sovereign Europe. How can the US do that in this context? And second, how can the US continue help, or be more successful in helping the European countries increase their defense budgets, despite, of course, the current pandemic, which will be a big problem in the years to come?
Thank you, General. I actually want to bring in Tori into this, because I think the point on the sort of Biden administration perhaps being a setback in some ways in the European sort of theater of taking more responsibility for their own strategic affairs and autonomy has been something that a lot of people have been talking about here. And I'd love to get your perspective on how do you think actually the Biden administration might behave and what role will it play in maybe pushing further these points or not?
Thank you, Reem. It's a great question. Let's focus on the positives first. I mean, I think we can, I see kind of three primary positives to President-elect Biden and the Biden administration in how it will approach the transatlantic relationship. I'm sure none of these will come as complete surprise to the panelists or audience members, but first, we now have a committed transatlanticist in the White House. Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, has a long career of supporting NATO expansion throughout the 1990s during his time in the Senate on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. He was a primary proponent of pushing back against Russian aggression and Russia's annexation of Crimea, invasion of Eastern Ukraine, with supporting the European Deterrence Initiative. The defense spending for NATO began under the Obama-Biden administration with the 2014 Wales Summit pledge for 2% defense spending. Again, just going back in this long career that Vice President Biden has had in foreign policy, was a strong proponent of NATO's operations in the Balkans. And again, we see a committed transatlanticist now in the White House, now in the presidency. Second, and I think that this is another positive for the transatlantic relationship, we have an administration who is more likely to work through multilateral institutions rather than against them. Throughout the campaign, the now president-elect has said that the United States will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords on day one. This is an administration that is likely to rejoin the World Health Organization, to relaunch discussions on the Iran nuclear issue, and to relaunch and restart conversations on important arms control treaties as well. So those are all three positives that I think we have to look forward to. I can also add that this is a president who is unlikely to look at the European Union as a direct competitor in the way that this previous administration has. I know this is a very defense-focused conversation, but I think we should keep in mind that Europe's primary geopolitical weight lies in its economic weight, lies in its regulatory power. And so to have an administration that is less likely to push back on European strategic autonomy in the regulatory and economic framework in the ways that President Trump was not willing to do, labeling the European Union a direct competitor, a foe, levying Section 232 tariffs on EU exports of steel and aluminum. I mean, these are, again, positives from day one that I think we can expect from a US administration. That being said, a lot of the differences that people have discussed on this call already will remain. Burden sharing will remain an important issue. Differences on China policy will remain. Seeking greater European unity on issues such as 5G and investment screening to reduce the vulnerabilities that Europe has vis-a-vis China will be an important issue for this administration to take into conversations with Europeans early on in the first year. And so, again, I think we're starting from a more positive footing because we have a committed transatlanticist, someone who's more willing to work through multilateral institutions, less likely to push back on Europe as a direct competitor in the ways that we saw the previous administration do. But big challenges, big questions remain. And I would highlight, again, burden sharing and China policy as two kind of ultimate or priority challenges that we're going to have tough conversations about early on.
Thank you, Tori. I want to actually bring in Ambassador Guiton and Admiral Fogo into this, and specifically on the China issue, because we've seen that actually under the leadership of President Macron, a more European approach, a more assertive approach to, and a more strategic approach to China. And I'd love for Ambassador Guiton to give us a bit more sort of context on that, and sort of also comment on what you raised, Tori, in terms of the challenges ahead with the Biden administration on this issue in particular. Although I am no longer seeing Ambassador Guiton, we may have lost her there. Just giving her a second. Oh, All right, maybe Admiral Fogo, do you want to jump in on that point on China policy and what the sticking points may be and how there could be a way forward in the alliance?
Sure, let me take a stab at it. Again, I'm not a politician, and I'm not a China basher. I do believe that if China were to observe a peaceful rise, it would be better for everyone in the world. I do understand why European partners and allies will reach out to China because cash is king and they have to spend. However, I am also have not built up enough trust in a relationship with China to think or to be naive enough to think that their interests are our interests. Let's talk about 5G. I've referred to it as the Trojan horse. You bring it into your house, turn out the lights, and go to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, out pops the Chinese intelligence services. So when we talk about interoperability, we've got to be very careful that that interoperability is not corrupted by some foreign power that's trying to sweep information off of our communications and connectivity. We've seen them do it in intellectual property for decades, and it's been brought to their attention. They've made some cosmetic changes, but nothing deep and serious to build that trust. France and the United States diverge on interests in Africa. I, for one, think we ignore Africa at our own peril. When you talk about great power competition and you talk about threats from China in Indo-Pacific, I say, what about Africa? I spent a lot of time down in Africa over 10 years. The French realized the importance of the Sahel, and they've certainly kept Mali from falling into the wrong hands. We ignore Africa at our own peril. The Chinese are all over the place. They're in Djibouti alongside us. French forces are there, American forces are there, and they're working their diplomacy, although I don't know that they have a great school of diplomacy. If you've read about the Wolf Warriors, you know what I mean, throughout the African continent. The difference between Westerners and Chinese is that when we go down there to do some development or build a base, we actually hire workers from that country, indigenous to that country. So there are 1,000 day workers in Djibouti, and the United States supports a significant portion of the gross domestic product of Djibouti. I know France does in other areas around the west coast of Africa and the Sahel as well. The Chinese come in, they bring their own labor, so they don't really give anything back. And I think that there is some buyer's remorse over time. Bottom line is Africa is going to have 2.5 billion people, according to the United Nations, by 2050. We ignore that at our own peril. Less than probably 40–50% of those 2.5 billion are going to be under the age of 24. Either we help them with development, education, safe haven sanctions, and finding a job. We're going to pick up an AK-47, and they're going to go an alternative route. So I think France has figured that out. France has made some significant sacrifices there. I attended many ceremonies at JFC for soldiers and special forces, particularly the mass casualties during the helicopter accident, where we observed silence, sang the Marseillaise, raised the tricolor in remembrance, and then went back to work with kind of a sad look on our face. So they've made sacrifices. The United States had supported that initiative. There were some questions over the last year as to whether or not we would continue to support. I think we should. I think we should get more involved in Africa, and that is great power competition. So I'll turn over to, I know Ambassador Guiton looks like she's back, so I'll let her comment as well.
Yeah, just to give her a bit more time, there seem to be some technical difficulties, but thank you so much, Admiral, for bringing up actually Africa and Western Africa and the Sahel, because we have another, we saw this year how important cooperation, military intelligence cooperation from the US with the French troops on the ground was, how determinant that was in taking out, the top jihadist in that theater. And there's a question from the audience from Anne Corpé, who says, what about Sahel cooperation? Is the election of Joe Biden a guarantee that it will continue despite Donald Trump's wish to withdraw American forces from the Sahel? Admiral, do you have any insight into that? And Tori as well?
No, I don't have any insight into how President-elect Biden is going to vote with regards to the Sahel. However, what happens in the Sahel is linked to the alliance. Many of you may or may not be familiar with NATO's Strategic Direction South hub for Africa. So that's something that started on my watch, brought it to full operational capability. It is a magnificent tool. It is something that is addressed by the military committee, by the Secretary General, and by the permanent representatives to complete the circle of deterrence and defense in the alliance. We're doing pretty good in the north. We're doing okay in the east. We need to focus on the south. There's all sorts of illegal migration issues, trafficking in arms, narcotics, people. This needs to be brought under control, and you're not going to do it with a flotilla of ships off North Africa or Libya. It's just too costly. So we've got to work with partners and allies, and we've got to establish relationships, and we've got to establish liaison cells and missions on the African continent. And for the first time, I think this year in Exercise Jupiter Jackal, during my watch, we'd reached out to the African Union, and if COVID does not prevent, I think Jupiter Jackal will actually have African observers involved, which is very, very important. The Sahel, what's going on down there with the French and other partners and allies is kinetic. That is a combat operation. What I'm talking about with the hub is non-kinetic. It's a different way of thinking of connecting individuals, communicating with one another, figuring out what needs are, and then answering those needs. The region of the Sahel needs to be stabilized. I'll tell you this, what the United States was doing for French forces in terms of intel sharing and some costs for airlift and transportation was a bargain. So if somebody in the Biden White House is looking at this, take a look at the numbers. And I think it was a bargain for us to be able to do that. The United States was providing the intel support and the lift. There are some U.S. forces down there. Obviously, we lost some soldiers and special forces down there. You all know about that. The French are doing more of the kinetic activity. Americans are not doing that. It's a bargain. I think we ought to look hard at it. And if anybody asks me, I would be supportive of continuing that relationship in the way that it was laid out 3 or 4 years ago.
Thank you, Admiral. Ambassador Guiton, are you back with us? Yeah.
Yes, I'm with you again, and I can tell you I'm not using Huawei as a provider.
Well, I mean, I wanted to just bring you back in on the China issue, as Tori had mentioned it. Did you hear what Tori had said, or should I recap?
You know, I think you were addressing the Americans' support to our operations in the Sahel region, and I can only emphasize what was said, which means that indeed we're relying on some of the critical enablers provided by our American friends to counter terrorism and lead a coalition that involves now more and more Europeans. And I think this is something unprecedented in terms of European endeavor to fight terrorism concretely and to do more and more. I mean, most recently, thanks to the framework and the support that our American friends are continuing offering us, we are able to target CBOs. We are able to also make a success of hostages rescues. And obviously, I mean, from our perception, this is not really a bargain. This is more of a military solidarity and common endeavors that we are trying to carry on. We do it because, the force protection offered by our forces to some of the operations taking place is something that doesn't have any other actor able to do it and deliver on the ground for the time being. Barkhane, Sabre, our special forces, etc. I mean, all of that is a massive involvement and a long-lasting effort. I think, I mean, our intervention is a good multiplying factor for your investments in the region as Americans, because obviously, with some key assets, we managed to deliver a lot of effects, a lot of results and outputs. And now, including together, I mean, we were speaking about strategic autonomy, but honestly, we have now, including European partners that are usually more reluctant to intervene in a non-permissive environment, a semi-permissive environment, and they're ready to deploy some of their special forces to advise, accompany, and assist Malian forces. And this is already working. We have Estonians with us. We will have Czech partners and Sweden joining us, teaming up with us. I think this is unprecedented. It's a good laboratory for strategic autonomy. How the Europeans can be real security providers in and tackle threats that our American friends are not ready to take up because they are busy elsewhere, and they're busy elsewhere, including because they're addressing some of the major strategic issues that we share as well. And just to mention that, the issues of Russia or China, we also face them in Africa.
Well, I mean, it's interesting.
If I may, Reem, just to respond to the ambassador, I couldn't agree with you more. When I say the term bargain, it's because when you're looking at an issue, a strategic issue like continued support for French special forces or the coalition that is on the ground in terms of intel sharing or lift capability. And I would also add one more ally to your list. I think the Romanians are helping down there as well. And that's really out of area for them and quite commendable. But for me, as a briefer, often I had to talk to people who did not wear a uniform or who were unfamiliar with what's happening. And these are the people that provide the resources. So they could be, leaders back in Washington, either appropriators, authorizers, congressional leadership, working through the combatant commander, General Steve Townsend, and trying to help him put together his thoughts. The offices of the Secretary of Defense, for example, who did a pretty hard look at all combatant commands across the globe. And so when I say bargain, the thought that I'm trying to convey to a government that was formerly very transactional is that this is something that makes sense for American forces to support, because in terms of cost to either the Treasury or in terms of putting boots on the ground, there's not a significant need for boots on the ground, and the cost is pretty minimal to help partners and allies do the preponderance of activity in a non-permissive environment, as you pointed out, or in many cases, a kinetic environment. And that's the way you got to kind of walk people through this, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. So, when I use terms like that, that's why I go where I go in governments which tend to be transactional as far as our political masters are concerned.
Tori? Oh, sorry. Ambassador Guiton, did you want to add something?
Yes, very briefly, just to thank the Admiral for those elements, and perhaps an additional element. I mean, you were referring to strategic autonomy at the beginning of our conversation, but honestly, when you see how dependent we are also on some of the strategic capabilities that our American friends are providing to us, if tomorrow we were to address those threats, those crises in a more autonomous manner, then we would need indeed to acquire those capabilities, and sometimes we do acquire those capabilities from our American friends, and this continues to be a major part of our imports. But we also try to address that by developing our industry and our trying to structure our industrial basis and making sure that we address some of those loopholes by cooperating further among Europeans, and that's where the European defense initiatives are playing a very prominent role, because they will offer us, just like through the PESCO commitments or through the European Defence Fund, the exact tools to address those loopholes and make sure that tomorrow we can respond to those crises without having to call for enablers from our American friends. Thank you.
Tori?
Well, just to make a broader point, I think it's really interesting in this conversation already. We're moving from looking at strategic autonomy as a contentious, heated debate over rhetoric to something that's far more positive, that shows European partners taking the lead to address shared security challenges without needing the United States to kind of bear the primary burden. And I think the Sahel is a perfect example, as both the Admiral and Ambassador have mentioned. Look, following this election, we've seen a divided America. We've seen the sitting president get over 71 million votes now. This question that Europeans have been asking themselves about whether Trumpism will remain beyond President Trump, I think there's many ways to parse that out and say what that means. But one issue is over the topic of burden sharing. This was a topic that has been longstanding within the American public. This was an issue before the Trump administration, during the Biden, during the Obama administration. Americans are tired of forever wars. Tired of over-engagement in the Middle East. If you look at the foreign policy establishment, so to speak, there is a shift to focusing more on the Indo-Pacific, on the Asia-Pacific, on the rise of China. So the more that Europeans can do to shoulder the burden within the European, North African strategic theater, I think the better, especially because these questions are not going away. This idea of burden sharing is not going away. And the idea of Europeans kind of shouldering more of the burden for security challenges in the theater is not going away either. And so again, this is the context within which we can have a more positive conversation about strategic autonomy that is not pitting Europeans against Americans, particularly within the even more contentious subject of military and security issues. As I mentioned on other issues like economic, technological, regulatory issues, strategic autonomy takes on, I think, a different light and a very different conversation.
I actually wanted to bounce off of both things that Tori and Ambassador Guiton said. You know, it was very interesting to hear Ambassador Guiton say that the Sahel is really a laboratory, a real life laboratory for strategic autonomy, and also bring into question this issue of sort of European reliance on American technology, American armament, which President Macron brought up when he was in Lithuania at Vilnius University last month. Ambassador Guiton, I mean, we saw that France has been, asking its European partners to step up, military involvement in the Sahel. And we saw that it took a long, hard push, and we're still not there completely. How do you assess this current sort of real life, real-time experiment at this point? I was struck after the comments by President Macron about sort of European reliance on US armament technologies. I was following him in Lithuania, and I ran into a Lithuanian official right after that and kind of, asked him, what do you think? That seemed to be directed at you guys, among other people. And there was a roll of the eyes and an immediate, look at the European budget that was just passed and how little the share of defense is. We are far from being able to do that. So on those 2 points, I'm really interested in hearing what your perspective is, Ambassador.
Thank you very much for that question. I mean, the reliance on the Americans in terms of capabilities, in terms of technologies, this is not something new. But I think the kickoff moment for us to start addressing those issues was really a few years ago. And I remember this declaration from our president, Emmanuel Macron, at La Sorbonne. This was the very moment where we articulated a number of elements that indeed are embedded under the concept of strategic autonomy. But in fact, I can tell you very frankly, strategic autonomy, the concept, is of interest to me only if it delivers facts and real outputs. And from that perspective, I'm looking at European defense budget levels and how, following the crisis, they will evolve. I'm following very closely how the procurement processes in our neighboring countries, in EU member states, EU allies will evolve, and how we will be able to scrutinize in the future defense investments so that we can preserve us from foreign interferences. And I'm, of course, extremely vigilant to making sure that we have the right tools to, include innovation, high-end innovation in our capability development processes. And that means that indeed the Europeans have to address some of their systemic problems, like the fragmentation of their industry, some of their redundancies, and a number of things that then will matter to the parliaments, those very parliaments that are in charge of approving some of the deployments of those assets abroad. And that's perhaps the answer to the other question. Why did it take us so much time to make sure that the Europeans would plug and play with us? I think it's because we had to address first issues of political will. Not easy for a certain number of our partners to team up when it's not an EU CSDP mission or a NATO operation as such. So the framework, the question of the framework. So here, if you have only a few European member states that are interested in intervening, in using military intervention as a tool of response to a regional crisis, then sometimes the consensus is more difficult to achieve. So you have to make sure that you can build also, some kind of coalitions, small coalitions, to try to deliver the response, the right response. And secondly, I think it's also because there are a number of financial, legal issues that needed to be addressed, and time for the parliaments to realize that there was a lot of good results to achieve through that commitment. And parliaments realized that indeed the terrorist threat remains very high on our continent, and hopefully the recent developments in France and Vienna again illustrated the importance of countering terrorism. This is a major problem. And finally, the fact that there are, in the meantime, the number of crises that may also have an impact on the Sahel developed. The situation in Libya and the risk for some of the weapons there to just fuel tensions in the Sahel, the risk of spillover effects from the current countries of the G5 to other countries, coastal countries, etc. The need also to mitigate the risk of a continuation of threat from Western Africa to Eastern Africa. All of that was part of the equation. And I think that now we raised awareness among our partners, European partners, and the European Intervention Initiative was really useful also in addressing those common issues.
Thank you, Ambassador. Time just flies. We have about 7 minutes left and so many questions that we're not going to get to. I wanted to actually sort of open this question from Charles Tepeau of WINUP to probably Tori and the Admiral in a first sense, which is that French-American military cooperation is very intense and has great potential, but the real issue is often how other European countries assess French policies more than how Washington discusses with Paris bilaterally. So how do you think the next US administration will deal with European military divergences? And what will Washington say to Warsaw and Berlin about strategic autonomy? Tori, do you want to take a stab at that first?
I'll let the Admiral go first to cover the military components, and then I'll jump in.
Okay, so that's a pretty tough question. I think the first thing that has to happen is there needs to be a rebuilding of a relationship there between Washington and Paris, something that is perhaps more communicative, more frequent, and a sharing of what are our interests, what are your interests, how do we move forward, and perhaps multilateral dialogues through the alliance with other alliance partners. You mentioned Germany. You mentioned Germany, which has been the brunt of the complaining from this side of the transatlantic bridge on burden sharing, and then Poland, who has really stepped up and said, hey, we want more in terms of forces and basing and participation in the alliance. So I think that needs to happen first. One of the ways to do that, I'm going to go back to a traditional means and a quick funny story. When I worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen, one day Stephen Covey of the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People came to his office, and the Admiral knew him, and he had done several lectures for flag leadership for the Navy when he was Chief of Naval Operations. And Covey brought Admiral Mullen something called an Indian talking stick, something from our Native American history in this country. And the Admiral was quite intrigued with it, and he showed it to me afterwards. And he said, well, there are 2 rules on this stick. One is that he who holds the stick has the floor. However, so you can imagine, warring tribes about to go to war, and they're having a dialogue before they do that, before they cross a red line. And the second rule is that he who holds the stick, it may be a chief or a brave in that tribe that's about to fight, he has to represent the issue, the argument, the disagreement through the lens of the eyes of the other tribe. In other words, so why can't we figure this out? And the Admiral actually used to use that to resolve differences between National Guard and regular service. So that would probably be one way to start. Don't take it as a sophomore comment. I think we need to look at what France thinks their interests are, what we think our interests are, and try to come to common ground and move forward. And the same thing with other partners and allies. Last thing I'll say is, I always keep a copy of the NATO Charter with me at any time, and that was a carryover from Jim Stavridis. NATO's been a pretty strong alliance since we signed the Washington Treaty right here in Washington, D.C. in 1949. And Article 5 is the bedrock of the alliance in the Washington Treaty. An attack on one is an attack on all. In over 70 years of alliance history, Article 5 has only ever been used once, and that was the attack on the United States on 9/11. And there is a memorial outside the new NATO headquarters in Brussels that has pieces of the World Trade Center built into that memorial, steel from that structure. I always tell my American friends together. And so the alliance has hung together for over 7 decades, and I hope we go for another 7. So we just got to figure this out, talk, work together, and move forward, and not waste resources. The alliance is the best alternative to non-military and military solutions in Europe and Africa. We don't need to go off into other dialogue about an army under the European Union, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Admiral Tory.
I hate to go after the Admiral because those were very good closing points to wrap up the discussion, but I will make 3 very quick points on the question that gets to European divisions between Paris and Warsaw, or Berlin and Paris. And, I think that divisions within Europe on a range of issues are one of the primary reasons that we don't see greater transatlantic cooperation on shared challenges. Yes, we've talked about weakened trust within the alliance, a lot of which Washington bears the responsibility for, but there are also longstanding divisions across Europe on a range of issues from climate to defense that Europeans will have to work out in order to be a more unified, coherent partner with Washington. That's point 1. Point 2 is that as we are trying to overcome divisions within Europe, I think that Washington should try to reach out to the European Union more as a partner in approaching shared challenges together, whether that be on defense and being more supportive of initiatives like the European Defense Fund and PESCO, not kind of knee-jerk pushing back against those, but more broadly developing a strategic relationship with the European Union as it does try to build more unified policies on everything from 5G to investment screenings to defense. That's point 2. And point 3, especially post-Brexit, where we are losing the United Kingdom as a priority partner for the United States in the EU as that bridge partner. Washington's going to need new priority partners within the EU and also within NATO. And I think this is where we should be looking to Berlin, but also to Paris to be that priority partner and to be a partner that is able to forge coalitions of willing partners, whether that be with Poland on some issues or with Spain and Italy on others, depending on the topic, to be that bridge, to be that leader of building willing coalitions across Europe. And I think given the range of issues that we've talked about today, the French leadership on defense issues, on ending European naivete toward China is another reason why Paris can be one of those priority partners, especially in a post-Brexit and also post-US presidential election timeframe.
Thank you, Tori. And I'm sorry, we're completely out of time. I'm sorry to all of our attendees who asked all sorts of great questions on terrorism, on Russia, on the Eastern Med. We'd need another hour, I think, with our great panelists to get to all of this. And it just shows the great interest in these very important strategic issues. Thank you to Ambassador Guiton, thank you to Admiral Fogo, and thank you, Tori, again, for taking part in this panel. And I will give the floor to Benjamin Haddad of the Atlantic Council.
Thank you so much, Rim, and thank you all for this really terrific and broad conversation. We talked about China and great power competition. We talked about the bilateral cooperation against terrorism in the Sahel. And I thought there were really some very important points that were made about how European strategic autonomy is not only compatible with the alliance, but is actually a bonus to the alliance, having a strong and autonomous Europe that can step up as a responsible partner to US security. So I want to really thank you all. You know how important this conversation is for us at the Atlantic Council. Our mission is promoting US engagement with allies, and especially in such perilous times. Rim, you mentioned that we got a lot of interest, a lot of questions. So I will just encourage people who were on Zoom and did not get their question answered to first read the terrific report that we're launching today by Olivier Bell and Jeff Lightfoot, and engage with them on Twitter. They're both on Twitter. They're both pretty reactive. Ask us questions, let them answer, put them on the spot, and let's continue this conversation. Thank you so much to all. And with that, I wish you a good day.